Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by American Jewish Committee. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Joining us today are Attila Somfalvi, a political commentator at Ynet, and Ellie Hockenberg from I-24 News, who will share their perspectives on Israel's fourth round of elections since 2019. Moderating this conversation is the director of AJC Jerusalem, Avital Leibovich. After we hear from our esteemed guests, time permitting, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Avital, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claire, very much. And hello to all those joining us today, to those celebrating Pesach. Happy Pesach to you. Thank you so much, Ellie, for joining us today as well, especially that you chose to celebrate your birthday today with us. I much appreciate it.
Very much humbled to be with you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Ellie is the diplomatic correspondent for I-24 News, and Attila will join us momentarily. So Ellie, we have been following a very political turmoil kind of periods in Israel. 2 years, 4 elections. How did Israel even end up in this situation?
2 years and not much have changed, if at all. It appears that the bottom line remains yes or no to Benjamin Netanyahu. And if in the previous rounds there was some sort of ambiguity in this respect, you know, we were still speaking in terms of the so-called right-wing bloc vis-a-vis the center-left-wing bloc. This time around, it was very clear-cut. No one was even pretending that there's any other debate, not to speak about policy or agenda, God forbid, when you're electing your representatives in parliament and in a cabinet. It was simply yay or nay to Benjamin Netanyahu. And it is as simple as looking at the past 24-hour news cycle to see how dominant is Netanyahu in this respect. It's all a question of whether you're joining him or opposing him, willing to cooperate with him or rejecting, dismissing this option altogether. And many pundits here in Israel suggest it has to do also with his legal challenges that I think, are profoundly intertwined to an extent. And again, we just need to look at the timetable of next week to see how indeed intertwined those issues are. On the Monday, the Israeli president will see all parties representatives from the biggest to the smallest, one after another. Every single one of them will arrive at the president's residence, let him know who they recommend to be honored with the first shot at forming a coalition. But at the very same day, Netanyahu's trial will be open, the juicy part, if you will, the evidentiary phase of the trial, and a day after, Parliament will be sworn in. So again, we're seeing this spiral. And if we're trying to even initiate a conversation over, again, policy matters, agenda, even Netanyahu himself, who is so-called the leader of the hawkish elements here in Israel, we're not talking about right-wing policies being promoted or not, but rather, again, if you are willing to cooperate with Benjamin Netanyahu or no. And I think that this question, or you know what, I will rephrase, as long as the debate, as long as the discourse revolves around the question, yay or nay to Netanyahu, at least the most recent history shows that Benjamin Netanyahu takes the lead, again, as long as the discourse remains he himself.
I think you're bringing a very interesting point to our viewers, because usually the political scene has been divided to two camps, the liberals and the right-wingers. And this time around, just like you mentioned, it's pro-Netanyahu camp and replace Netanyahu camp. And that is a dramatic difference. Do you
Right.
think this has to do with the party, the Likud party, which is represented by Netanyahu? Netanyahu is the chair of the party, or do you think it's a personal matter?
I actually think that the best demonstration for that is not necessarily Netanyahu's Likud party, but rather the so-called satellite parties. The best example, perhaps, the two ultra-Orthodox parties, the Sephardi Shas party and the Ashkenazi United Torah Judaism party, historically, traditionally, not aligned with this or that side of the political divide if we're dividing it into left or right. Quite the opposite. If we're talking about legislation attempts, the ultra-Orthodox were cooperating with Arab parties more naturally than they did with right-wing parties. But during the, again, quote unquote, Netanyahu era, he managed to enshrine or solidify his position as the leader of the so-called right-wing bloc, including those two ultra-Orthodox parties that are not sharing necessarily a similar agenda. With that said, their electorate somewhat tilted to the right. I think it is more accurate when we're talking about, again, the Sephardi Shas party. And at the same time, this time around is particularly fascinating because if we're looking at who are the main players at this point in time, we can dub first the Islamist Arab Brown Party that is being rooted after from both center left-wing powers and right-wing powers. So it comes to show that we're not really talking about policy matters here, but rather on who is able to solve this jigsaw puzzle of setting up a coalition, or more accurately, who is willing to facilitate yet another Netanyahu coalition. And at this point in time, it appears that both the ultra-Orthodox parties and again, the Islamist Arab Brown Party are considering to do so. The clash comes when you're diving into right-wing elements, but I'm sure we will get to that a bit later. But what I was meant to say is that issues, again, of policy or ideology have been completely neglected in those 4 consecutive rounds of elections in favor of just plain big brother politics to an extent. Who will reach this golden number of 61 seats? Or again, more accurately, will Benjamin Netanyahu get those 61 seats? Yes or no?
I agree with you. And, you know, I was speaking to our American friends, and sometimes they were discussing issues like annexation, which wasn't a part of any party's campaign at all in the last couple of years. It just was out of the story. I mean, the story was really, as you say, personal, with capabilities to form the government, yes or no, really the political expertise. And the top issues, the major issues, security, and the Palestinian conflict, and international relations and relations with the Arab world, they were gone from the campaign. So that's quite interesting. But I just want to, in the sake of explaining to our viewers, can you describe what is the current situation? Because sometimes I get these questions and people ask me, so wait, there is no functioning government. What happens with security? What happens with budget? What happens with education? So what is right now the situation in terms of the government in Israel? Is there a government? Is there a different type of government?
Right. So there's an interim government, a transitional government that is operating. I wouldn't dare to say in full capacity. I think that those recent cabinet meetings dealing with the coronavirus crisis, everyone were well aware of the fact that they need to ditch politics aside and try to, unite behind the greatest goal of all, to secure the welfare and the health of Israelis. Even that was not operating properly. So I'm saying it with great sadness, but I don't think that the political players are even aspiring to have a functioning government. They just want to form a government, even if it will not last long. But I do want to go back for one second, if I may. It's not as if the debate is completely flattened. The issue, yes or no to Benjamin Netanyahu, it entails much more than that. And one of the speeches of Netanyahu in the past year that I cannot forget, he mentioned Socrates' speech before he drank the poison and was talking about, the king philosopher, whether the people should have the power to elect their representatives or whether they should elect the most educated one, et cetera, et cetera. So it does the issue of Benjamin Netanyahu touches very sensitive and fundamental points when we're seeking to establish a community or a state in our case. So it's not as if it's just personal. I think that perhaps Netanyahu's greatest success to an extent is that I think that almost every Israeli, sitting in their car, stuck in a traffic jam, all by themselves, right? Not with a taxi driver or anything. They're contemplating on Benjamin Netanyahu. Let it be they're in favor of him or opposing him. He managed to, again, touch very sensitive points in the very basic notions, the basic questions of Israelis of what type of a society they want to live in. But going back to the current state of affairs, so there are many pundits suggesting that we should seek to form a transitional government. It might last maybe for 1 year, not longer, but that will take us away or salvage us from this 2-year long deadlock. Not sure that's the solution. Not that I think anyone can play prophet in this respect, but there is a very substantial sentiment that unless something radical happens, let it be a clear-cut victory to this or that side, nothing can really mature politically, and the discourse will remain in those territories that we've been mentioning. And the election results, again, 4th time in a row, did not indicate that that the political landscape as a whole is mature enough to move to the next stage. So I think that we will be, swimming in this quagmire for a bit longer, even if a coalition will be formed in a few weeks.
You mentioned the vaccine, and I'm wondering the success of the vaccine, and there is no question that Israel is the vaccination nation, and I think the numbers—
Vaccination, as Netanyahu likes to dub it.
Exactly. I think the numbers are that 93% of 50-year-olds and above have been vaccinated in 2 doses, and only today I heard the Director General of the Health Ministry speaking about beginning to vaccinate kids ages 12 to 16 next month. So there's no doubt that this was a huge success. How much do you think this success played into Netanyahu and the party, the Likud party, in the current elections? Because what I'm seeing is a party that used to have a lot more than 30 seats,
Right.
even 40 seats in its peak. And now I see the numbers decreasing more and more and more. Only 30 seats after the great success of the vaccines. What do you make of this?
Right. So 2 main points here. I think that and excuse me for again going perhaps too philosophical to an extent. If we're talking about the tools of postmodernism, we are looking at the very same numbers, but any one of us can analyze them differently. So some could say 30 seats for the Likud party after the mass vaccination campaign, world-renowned, really applauded by all world leaders, a string of peace or normalization deals with Arab and Muslim countries against the backdrop of weekly, if not daily, protests against him. What a remarkable achievement. With that said, you can say the exact opposite. How come Netanyahu managed to bring Israel to the point where it is admired by all the world, again, for its success when it comes to the coronavirus pandemic? Only 30 seats. So this takes me to the second point, which is, again, the very unique political structure here in Israel. We're not talking about the Democratic Party vis-a-vis the Republican Party. The name of the game here is setting up a coalition. And many voters, for example, for the Zionist Religious Party, currently led by Bezalel Smotrich and his far-right counterpart Itamar Ben-Gvir, voters for this party knew that they are essentially voting for Netanyahu to retain the premiership, right? Similarly to many Shas voters in this respect, or United Torah Judaism Party. So it's not that we need to go back, even though it was very much undermined the notion of the traditional right-wing versus left-wing blocs here in Israel. When we're assessing Netanyahu's success, we do need to we need to zoom out and look at the overall landscape. And if we're looking at right-wing parties, and I'm, yes, including Naftali Bennett and his Yamina list, remained on the fence throughout the campaign. So some of his voters were at least hoping that he will give Netanyahu the premiership. And even Gideon Saar, who completely opposed Netanyahu during the campaign, and even Avigdor Lieberman, the root for this ongoing string of elections to an extent, all of these are right-wing voters. Yes, some of them are profoundly anti-Netanyahu voters, but if you ask them whether they're left or right, they say we are right-wingers. So if, yes, the Likud did experience a drop, but if we're looking at, again, right-wingers in Israel, we're seeing an upsurge in this respect. And this is interesting, not necessarily for this round of elections or the prospects of forming a coalition, but to future rounds. And I think that Yair Lapid, by the way, from the other side of the divide, realized that. And this is why he refrained from making any, let's put it that way, traditional leftist statements. If we're going back to the very naive notion of policy being part of politics.
You mentioned Lapid, and I'm thinking back even more than a decade, and we've seen a lot of attempts to build new parties that will replace the ruling party. If you remember, it was Kadima with Shaul Mofaz and then Tzipi Livni, and then Yesh Atid, as you mentioned, it was 2013, and then Blue and White. And there was one thing in common to all these parties, and that thing was that they failed. They really failed to replace the ruling party. So my question to you has to do with the Israeli public, because at the end of the day, we are talking about a vibrant democracy here in Israel, and the public, which is very much involved with around 70% voting percentage among the public. And the question is, maybe the Israeli public isn't ready to substitute the ruling party, the Likud. What do you think?
Well, just to add to the list that you've mentioned, parties that perhaps were not aspiring to begin with to replace the rule, but we had Kahlon, who at the end merged into the Likud party. We had Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked forming the new right, in the first round of elections, not making it across the electoral threshold, right? We're talking now about Naftali Bennett in terms of a potential prime minister. He did not make it across the electoral threshold. And of course, the Blue and White saga that I think will really be engraved in Israel's history books. I think that the bottom line is, and I will allow myself to be blunt, the Israeli public is fed up with so-called vanity lists that are all about this or that candidate, believing that they will be able to salvage the country and lead it to the next level. These elections very clearly, it is true that there's a natural decline in polls once a new party is being formed. We've seen it with Gideon Saar, we've seen it with Ron Hulday, longstanding mayor of Tel Aviv, the great hope of the the center left-wing bloc at the very beginning of this election race. Again, an entire party that was created just for the sake of its leader. And you can see what happened to Gideon Saar and even Naftali Bennett, with all due respect, of truly a key player in, again, this jigsaw puzzle of forming a coalition. But in terms of seats, not that impressive, not to speak again about Gideon Saar defecting from the Likud, saying, yes, we will be the new version of the Likud party. So again, I will reiterate my previous statement. I think that the Israeli public wants some sense of stability, recognizability, parties that they know what they stand for, more or less. And Yair Lapid, in that sense, did a good job, because the infrastructure of his party, one major element of it grassroots movements. You see many youngsters involved in the not just the campaign, but the party itself. And this is why Yesh Atid is still a major player in the landscape. But all those, again, vanityless, that the intention is just to bring their leader to a prestigious portfolio. I think that the Israelis are done with this game.
I want to speak for the next couple of minutes about the Arab voters, because I think it's a very interesting issue, and the entire situation, the current situation with the Arab voters is quite a unique one. Basically, what we have seen in these elections is that the Arab voter sat at home rather than went to vote. So in the previous election, there were approximately 56% of the Arab voters that went to the polls, but this time around was 44%.
Right.
Add to this the crash, there's no other way of describing it, the crash of the Arab joint list, which peaked at 17 seats just a couple of years ago, and now we're talking about 9, barely. So that's a huge crash. What do you make of the situation? Did the Arab voter lose trust, confidence in its politicians? Did they go to Jewish parties? What do you make of this situation?
Well, first of all, I think that if we were to sit here a year ago and you would have told me that the key political player in a path, any path to any future Israeli coalition would be, again, the leader of an Islamist Arab party, would say you're completely out of your mind. The fact that the Arab vote became such a crucial element in the political landscape of Israel 2021 comes to show that A, perhaps the winds of change are blowing, despite or maybe even because of this long-standing political turmoil, and B, that there is a shift that perhaps is more important from the Arab side of the political divide, meaning the Arab community, that is somewhat endorsing this pragmatic outlook of Mansour Abbas, the leader of the Ram party. Because what is he saying? He's saying, I don't care about satellite parties. I don't care about this or that agenda. I want to connect to the ruler, to the prime minister, the one that will be enabling me as leader of the Arab community to facilitate my community's needs. Let it be the high crime rates, let it be education, let it be a bad infrastructure in communities and villages and cities around the country. He's saying, leave politics aside. I have a community to take care for. And the Arab public appears to be responding very well to this notion, meaning that we, again, if I'm trying to look at the glass half full here, the Arab public is very much willing to find new connecting points with the overall population that are more socialist, that have to do with daily lives and not just the grand questions of annexation of the Green Line, yes or no to this or that peace deal. And the saddening thing here is that politicians from the Jewish side of the political divide are capitalizing on that politically, not so much in the leadership fashion or manner that I, as a citizen here, would hope for. Again, not right-winger, not left-winger, just a citizen who wants to see a better communal life here for all. I think that the Arab public is more mature in that sense, or let me rephrase, Arab politicians, Mansour Abbas most notably, are more mature in that sense than the Jewish politicians, again, at this point in time. And going back to Benjamin Netanyahu, the fact that Netanyahu put a very clear-cut kosher stamp on including the Arab votes, let it be seeking their vote for his Likud party or cooperating with them in a bid to form a coalition, let it be by exterior support, or we're not talking about them being part of the government, but leaning on their exterior support is a major change. Or going back to this ancient phrase, only the right could bring peace. So only the right could bring the Arab politicians, make them relevant political players.
Actually, there's a lot of added value when you think about it. I mean, towards the Israeli population, recognizing an Arab party as an equal partner somewhat, or maybe even more equal than other parties. I think it's an important message to the Israeli public. I mean, it should have done years ago, but the Jewish parties made a mistake, I think, by abandoning the Arab voters. The Arab voters are 21.7% of Israel's population, and the fact that the Jewish parties failed to remain in touch, in ongoing contact with these voters, I think it's a mistake. From the Arab side, they also made a lot of mistakes. For example, sitting outside of the government deliberately, choosing year and year after, again and again, to sit outside of the government means initially that you can't be with the influencers. And Ra'am, this Arab Islamist party, which left the joint Arab list, is now bringing a new message of maybe a new kind of voters, new kind of Arab voters who are more modern, who are more educated, who want to
You know what, Abital?
integrate.
Not even if we're going back a few minutes to our earlier conversation about the ultra-Orthodox parties, if we're talking about legislation attempts or successes on behalf of ultra-Orthodox parties or Arab parties, they're much more alike in many socialist senses than they are with right-wing parties or center-left-wing parties. So to put at the center of attention the issue of, again, social needs, and not dismissing, but trying to make a distinction between political or diplomatic dilemmas, again, the Palestinian question, annexation, etc., and trying to create greater unity when we're talking about social reforms, we can see a very fertile ground for cooperation here. Again, I'm mentioning what may sound to foreign audience something very counterintuitive. Ultra-Orthodox parties and Arab parties, what can they possibly have in common? But we're talking about social agenda that is not dealing, again, with far-reaching policies over the fate or the borders of the state of Israel. They have so much in common, similarly to many other Jewish parties in between, that I fully agree are not capitalizing on it, even in a cynical political manner. Votes on the floor, right? Just fight for them. You have so many eligible voters here that you're not even trying to fight for their votes. So definitely a loss here from the, again, Jewish party's perspective. But I think that Benjamin Netanyahu, again, let it be for cynical political reasons or for genuine intention to create a social change here, the fact that he made them relevant and acceptable, or we are in a Jewish state, kosher political allies, might change, again, the way we perceive the overall landscape here in Israel. I hope we can see this notion bearing fruit in the next rounds. This time around, I think, was a significant jump for the Arab parties or the Arab public.
In any case,
nonetheless.
it's a historic move on their part, and that will definitely be written in the books of history, of political history in Israel. But I want to take you for a second to the liberal camp, because although in these elections, we said it earlier, there was a pro-Netanyahu camp and replacement Netanyahu camp, but there is also a liberal camp in Israel. And let's help our confused viewers and tell them who is the leader of this camp. Are they unified ideologically or not? And is there really a camp, or are we seeing bits and pieces of tiny parties trying to create an atmosphere that there is a camp like that?
I think it will be far-reaching to dub them a camp. They do share a mutual goal, and by them, I'm referring to Yair Lapid, leader of the Yesh Atid party, the second largest party, opposition leader in the previous parliament, Avigdor Lieberman, leader of the hawkish anti-Netanyahu Israel Beitenu party, that again traditionally was considered to be part of the Netanyahu, the right-wing bloc, but decided to part from them. We have the new player, standalone player, Gidon Sa'ar and his new Hope Party, Naftali Bennett, leader of the Yamina list, and Benny Gantz, alternate Prime Minister Benny Gantz and his Blue and White Party. That's all polls, by the way, projected him to be really flirting with the electoral threshold, barely making it in. At the end of the day, 8 seats. So I think that this is
but
also.
you know, the polls are never right here.
Yeah, but I think that this is a gap to that is distinguished enough to refer to. And of course, the Labour Party led by Merav Michaeli, another really beautiful story for looking at the past campaign, reviving an almost completely dead party, reviving it, making it relevant again, and the leftist Meretz party. But if we're going back to these 5 players, so they do share a mutual goal, or at least to an extent, to replace the Netanyahu rule or offer an alternative. But their interests, their individual interests are so different that they're, at this point in time, unable to mend fences. Yair Lapid refrained throughout the campaign from saying, or rather, you know what, I'll say differently. One of the main motifs of his campaign was to say, I am not fixated on becoming prime minister. The goal of paramount importance is to replace the existing one, trying not to play the Netanyahu game and put those signs, Netanyahu versus Lapid. But he kept on saying that. But the second election results were in, he launched a string of phone calls and meetings with all the relevant party leaders seeking to get their endorsement, fails to do so until this point in time, and all paths to any coalition led by him goes through Gidon Sa'ar and Naftali Bennett. Naftali Bennett is fearful to undermine his right-wing credentials, right? He wants to establish himself as a right-wing leader. He said during the campaign, time and time again, I will not sit in a government under Yair Lapid, not even as part of a potential premiership rotation deal, as we've seen between Netanyahu and Benny Gantz in the previous elections. But at the same time, he said, I will not lean on the support of the Arab party. So he's captured by his own election vows, even though they're destined to be breached. This is the essence of vows, I assume. He is now not working against Lapid, but rather against Netanyahu, because Israel's president, and this is a very important side note, the Israeli president is not bound to nominate a candidate with the relative highest number of recommendations, or the leader of the biggest party, but rather the one with the best prospects of forming a coalition. And Bennett, at this point in time, is in a very interesting position, because Lapid is failing to reach a sufficient number to make him a relevant player, but Bennett might. And this is a great question for Bennett himself, whether to go with the path that appears more convenient, to join forces with Netanyahu, or give it a try, give himself a try to an extent. Gidon Sa'ar, and I'll do it briefly, Gidon Sa'ar shares mutual fears with Bennett. He too fears to undermine his hawkish credentials, especially after parting from the Likud with a big bang, seeking again to offer an alternative right-wing rule. But he is maintaining solid contacts with both Lapid and Lieberman. Lieberman is focusing on the parliamentary route. He wants to limit Netanyahu's ability to form not this government, but future governments, and by that engulf him this time around. And Benny Gantz remains on the fence even as we speak. And this is truly fascinating, because some pundits here in Israel suggest that Gantz is not going either side of the axis. And by that, I mean Lapid, Lieberman, and Bennett Sa'ar. He's not leaning to either side because he secretly still hopes that a government will not be formed now, and not by merit, but by coincidence, he will take the premiership by November due to the, again, rotation agreement with Netanyahu he signed in the previous round. Not sure if that speculation is correct, but bottom line is all those 5 players might be sharing a goal, replacing Netanyahu, but their interests and their electoral bases are so different that it might not be enough to share one goal to get them together.
Exactly. I mean, it's very difficult to imagine someone as right-wing as Naftali Bennett, at least, that's the way he describes himself, and Gideon Saar, which you mentioned, sit with a very, very leftist liberal party like Meretz, or with the Arab joint list. The question is, what will overcome this ideological differences with the very strong will to replace the current government, or personal ego or personal aspirations? I mean, that's very challenging. But I want to ask you, I have two more questions before we go to I see there are tons of questions on the chat and people are asking as well. I want you for a minute to put your diplomatic hat on, diplomatic correspondent hat on, because I noticed that since Gabi Ashkenazi became foreign minister, and in the current year and a half, year plus of pandemic, he met with 17 foreign ministers. Right. So my question to you is, I mean, these are two axes, different axes. There's the political turmoil, which is really touching most of the fields of our lives here in Israel, but yet the international relations axis is continuing as if nothing really happened. So that has not been affected by the political situations, as you understand?
Well, I think that in this respect, several points that are worthy of our attention. First of all, the elections in the US, it feels like ancient history, but we here in Israel too were biting our nails to see the results. But either way, it somewhat serves, and again, excuse me for going back to Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu's previous campaigns heavily relied on his close ties with former President Donald Trump, right? And many suggested that if Biden was to take over, as he did, it will hurt Netanyahu. But Netanyahu's ticket in this respect goes either way. And we can go back to the Obama years, right? Netanyahu underlines his statesmanship skills as the only one who could, be in such a close connection with both Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin at the same time, but also is the only one who can face more hostile or not as friendly administration. And again, we can go back to the Obama years, the nuclear deal that is very timely as we speak as well. Netanyahu portrayed himself as the only leader that can stand in face of this American policy that can damage Israel's security, right? So Netanyahu plays a very interesting role when it comes to Israel's diplomacy. I agree that Gabi Ashkenazi did a very interesting work in the past few months because he did it somewhat quietly, maybe because the spotlight of Israel's attention was not at those meetings exactly. And we can see perhaps an indication for how Netanyahu drew very clear borders to his abilities or leeway as foreign minister when it comes to the Gulf countries, right? Gabi Ashkenazi was literally already packed on his way there and was unable to do so because Netanyahu made a very clear-cut decision that as long as the prime minister is not having his first celebratory visits in the Gulf, no other minister can, not even the foreign minister. He was excluded from the process leading to those groundbreaking normalizations deals, but he did again maintain the work of the foreign minister in a more low-key manner. But I think that the Israeli tension was simply not there. And even if we're going back to the question of Netanyahu, just in the weeks leading to election day itself, we had the Austrian chancellor and the Danish prime minister here in Israel. A week after, the Czech Republic prime minister and the Hungarian prime minister here applauding Netanyahu for his mere being even. And it didn't play a significant role this time around, even though it's Netanyahu's element. Diplomatic skills were somewhat pushed sideways this time around, I assume.
So I have a comment and a final question before we turn it to the questions of the public. My comment is that personally, I wouldn't call any American administration hostile towards Israel because I think it is, regardless of Republicans or Democrats, I think maybe there may be differences of opinions, of perspectives, of security issues, and so on. But I don't think hostile would be the appropriate way to.
100% was a way it was portrayed, utilized in campaigns vis-a-vis very specific electoral bases. Absolutely, a very important clarification. Thank you for that.
Great. And my final question, if you can give me a short answer. So next week, you mentioned the president will be meeting with the heads of different parties. And then what? What's the next step for us here in Israel?
All right. So I'll try to clear the clutter as simply as possible. So Monday is the big day that we're looking at. Again, from the biggest party to the smallest, we will see one party after the other, representatives of those parties arriving at the president's residence, the Likud party first, and the last one, keeping the drama really alive until the very last second, will be the Ram party, which is a key player this time around. Every one of them will arrive at the president and will have to give their recommendations or lack thereof, who should be nominated first to get a shot at forming a coalition, right? The president, since it is such a delicate political situation, wants to try and wrap it up even as early as Monday and declare who will be nominated as early as Monday, Tuesday. Theoretically speaking, he has until Wednesday to do so, April 7th, right? Right away, side note, Tuesday, Parliament will be sworn in. Regardless, there we will see perhaps some interesting legislation attempts for going back to Avigdor Lieberman's initiatives to limit Netanyahu's ability to form a coalition. But after Rivlin nominates a candidate, he will have 28 days to engage in coalition negotiations, meaning trying to reach again this golden number of 61 seats that will enable the formation of a coalition. If he fails to do so, the president can, and here the emphasis is on can, he's not obliged to, can give him an extension of 14 days. If that fails as well, the president can, once again, can nominate a second candidate. Similarly to the previous round, we had Netanyahu, and then the president allowed Benny Gantz to try. He failed. Either way, the next stage, let it be the president decides to give a second candidate a choice or not. The next stage is Parliament itself. All of this, of course, if a government is not formed. If it's formed, we can all open the champagne bottles, or some of us at least. Then the third part will be tossing the ball to Parliament itself. Parliament will have 21 days to find any candidate out of the 120 lawmakers with the ability to form a government, meaning he needs 60 supporters. If Parliament finds such a candidate, the president is obligated to give him a try to form a coalition, right? If that option fails as well, so I'm saying it, great sadness, Parliament automatically dissolves. No one can halt this train, and we will head to a fifth round of elections. So first candidate, potential extension. Second candidate, yes or no. Parliament's candidate, fifth election.
We don't want to say that word, the fifth election word. I hope we won't get there. Thank you for this. I'd like to turn it to Claire because I understand we have, Claire, a lot of questions from our audience.
Thank you. We do have a number of people, including Sherman Silber in St. Louis, who are asking, some people are calling for election reform to prevent yet another round of elections. What kind of changes could be made that would preserve Israeli democracy while also overcoming the political deadlock?
Wow, what a question. Yes, many are pointing the fingers not at the political players, but rather at the faults of the political system. The necessity to form a coalition, some suggest, is opening the door to some sort of quote unquote extortion, meaning that this tiny party of only 4 seats that is paramount or crucial for the formation of any coalition could demand extremely prestigious portfolios, right? And the coalition leader will either have to give in and give, again, a 4-seat party, which is minor if we're looking at the overall landscape, a very significant portfolio or other roles that will be key in determining this future government's policy, or will give up the ability to form a coalition. So definitely there are some challenges in the basic structure of the Israeli political game. But I think that in this respect, nostalgia could be very deceiving, right? After 4 consecutive rounds of elections, many Israelis are missing the good old days. But if we're looking at Israel's first government, right, the first government when everyone were still high from the rush, the adrenaline of the establishment of the Jewish state, we're talking about a relatively narrow government led by David Ben-Gurion and his Mapai party, 73 seats. That's it. Very narrow, right? Menachem Begin and his Charut party were excluded. The Communist Maki party was excluded. So he too, again, David Ben-Gurion back in the days had to reach out to tiny minorities parties in order to form a coalition. And this is perhaps the only way to have a fair, honest reflection of the different tribes of Israeli society. So yeah, the system itself might be broken, but unless someone offers a better alternative, I guess we're stuck with it, and politicians will just have to figure it out. I really don't have a better answer for that.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Robert Fishman in Connecticut, who asks, what do the results, or lack thereof, of this election mean for the future of Israel's relations with the Palestinians?
Wow, this is a great question, because the Palestinian issue was completely MIA from all campaigns throughout, not even the leftist Meretz party, not even the joint list of Arab parties were talking about the Palestinian issue. I think that the Israelis are so engaged in the domestic challenges now that this major question that obviously has an impact not just Israel's diplomatic posture, but also on its internal character, been pushed to the sideways completely. It can potentially become relevant again if we will see diplomatic moves gaining traction, let it be with the mediation or involvement of the American administration, or even Israel's new allies from the Gulf and other Arab and Muslim countries that will simply demand to put it back on the agenda. I don't see Israelis themselves making the Palestinian issue a central topic for debate unless they will be forced to at this point in time. This is my estimation. Avital obviously is far more engaged in that issue.
Yeah, I will add just one thing. Hypothetically, let's say that there is a government with 61 seats in another month. And let's say the Palestinian issue is brought before the parliament for some kind of a vote of decision and I don't know, path laying and so on. With a 61 seats, a very, very narrow government, or 62 or 63 in that sense, it will be very difficult to pass any legislation, any decision. And the Palestinian issue will be one of those issues that will probably not pass. And therefore, the attempt or the initial will of any political candidates that wishes to build a coalition is to have as wide government as possible, at least 70 seats or 67 or 68 seats, because again, should the Palestinian issue come on the table for legislation, for decision-making, it will most likely fail, just like any other major legislation attempt with a narrow government.
And Netanyahu had, not so long ago, what was dubbed here in Israel, the most right-wing government in the history of the state, while having what was dubbed, and again, not referring those statements to myself, but what was dubbed as the friendliest American administration ever. And these two components didn't even lead to far-reaching right-wing policies. So especially if we're talking about a narrow 61-seat government in this very fragile political structure to begin with, fully echoing every word of yours, Avital.
Thank you. We have several people, including Ray Termini in Dallas, asking, how do the Abraham Accords influence both the Arab and Jewish voters?
So as mentioned earlier, I think that many people believe that those achievements, those really truly historic, groundbreaking achievements, would play a more significant role politically speaking. And from Netanyahu's standpoint, he wanted to capitalize on that, not necessarily for political reasons, but also because there was very genuine excitement over those deals. He wanted to have his big celebratory visit to Abu Dhabi and Bahrain. It did not mature because of the coronavirus restrictions. But if we're going back to the issue of the Arab vote, here I do think it played a major role, because if we're talking about the Arab population being more open to being included in the Israeli society altogether, I think that this green light on behalf of such major Muslim and Arab powers again gave them a boost, or at least a sense of approval that their sentiments are correct, and it is possible to still maintain your Arab or Muslim character while cooperating with the Jewish state. So I think that even in the subconsciousness of Arab voters, those normalization deals did play a role in their voting patterns. Again, when we're talking about the Jewish public, I think that the discourse remained quite flat in that respect, meaning that it was, again, a situation of preaching to the choir. If you're pro-Netanyahu, then great achievement. If you're anti-Netanyahu, then you're anti-Netanyahu.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Janet Levine on Zoom, who asks, the first reform rabbi, Rabbi Gilad Kariv, has been elected to the Knesset, and it's gotten a lot of attention. Is this really a big deal relative to the political power of the Haredi parties?
Yes, because if we're talking about a potential government, again, at this specific point in time, it appears like a less feasible option. But in the earlier phases of the campaign, if we were talking about a potential Yair Lapid-led government that will include both Meretz and Labor and the ultra-Orthodox parties, Gilad Kariv's presence might have posed a hurdle in this respect. Yair Lapid, by the way, really changed his attitude. He started his initial campaigns with a very strong anti-ultra-Orthodox sentiment, perhaps echoing some of the motifs of his late father, Tommy Lapid. But as he matured as a political leader and a political player, he realized that it will be very difficult to exclude the ultra-Orthodox from any potential coalition. He softened his stance significantly. But if we're talking about a potential combination, again, of an alternative government that at this point in time appears less feasible, of Yair Lapid, for example, or another leader, and that will be able to bring together the Labor Party and the ultra-Orthodox parties, the presence of a reform rabbi is a problem for the ultra-Orthodox. As much as it may sound somewhat harsh for some viewers, for the ultra-Orthodox parties, this is a very clear red line.
I just want to add, with your permission, the fact that, the Labor Party, which the Reform Rabbi Kariv, which is a very nice man, by the way, he's a part of, is a very small party with 7 seats, and the influence of this party is minimal. Therefore, the Rabbi Kariv didn't make such big headlines here in Israel as he did across the ocean. Additionally, the Labor Party traditionally deals with issues like welfare and minorities' rights and LGBT and single mothers' rights. And in other words, they don't deal with greater issues such as security and strategic issues. So overall, what I'm saying is that the overall influence will probably be very limited. Of course, it still does not mean that the ultra-Orthodox parties will not be angry by this, because they will be, but still their influence, their day-to-day impact will be limited.
Thank you. And this will be our final question before I turn it back to you, Avital. And it comes from Trevor Shaw in Atlanta, who asks, if all the deadlines to form a government expire, do you have hope that the results of a 5th election would be any different from the previous 4?
I'll have a very short answer. And I think it's not the answer you were hoping for. No, if government will not be formed now, there's no reason to believe the next government, if we will see yet another round of elections, will have better chances at being formed. Again, and I'm going back to the early stages of our conversation this evening, as long as the debate remains yay or nay to Benjamin Netanyahu, the entire landscape is captivated by that notion. And I'm not pointing fingers, obviously, at anyone here throughout the political landscape, but not even the camp opposing Netanyahu. And they did have several rounds, to tweak their campaigns and try to articulate their messages. Not even them were able to find another strong point to target their electoral base other than "we are not Benjamin Netanyahu." And I fear that as long as this remains the biggest question, and there are no any other questions about what type of state we want to see here, what type of a society we want to see here. Again, there's no reason to believe that it will be easier to form a next government. But with that said, the Israeli political game is full of surprises, as we've seen just a year ago, with Benny Gantz parted from his blue and white partners and joined forces with Netanyahu with this very peculiar unity government. No one predicted that happening. So I will not dare to predict, but if no political leader will be able to bring new topics to the table, the deadlock, even if will be untangled for a brief second, and we'll see this or that government, if no other issues will take center stage, this hedgehog, how do you call this movie with Groundhog Day? A feeling I fear will persist here.
Thank you, Ellie, so much. Ellie is the diplomatic correspondent for I-24 News. Again, thank you so much for sharing your experience, your knowledge, your expertise with us. I much appreciate it. Again, I'd like to apologize for the fact that Attila just joined, but we are closing right now. So unfortunately, you couldn't be with us. I'd like to wish everyone Chag Sameach and send you wishes of good health. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, Avital, for the opportunity. Thank you. Happy Passover.
Thank you, Ellie, and thank you, Avital, for sharing your insights. I would also like to thank our global audience for joining us. If you enjoyed today's program, please consider making a donation to AJC at ajc.org/donate. Thank you all and have a great day.